Well, as was said there, the big department store in Newcastle, just a few minutes up the road, Phoenix. We actually have one in my hometown of Tunbridge Wells also, but the one in Newcastle is more grand and impressive. And the big Christmas window display is indeed of Narnia. All those years ago, C.S. Lewis published his 7 children's books, beloved and read by not only children but adults, many generations. And they're not just stories just for the sake of fun and amusement. They are a story that shapes the imagination and gives people the furniture with which to make sense of the Christian message. And it is quite astonishing, all these years after the death of C.S. Lewis, that still today his name, his stories, his contribution are celebrated and used. The wardrobe, the fawn, the beavers, Aslan the lion, the one who is sacrificed on the stone altar to undo the winter that never ended. Movies continue to be made. Back in 1988 to the late 1990s, the BBC did a series of TV programs retelling the Chronicles of Narnia. 1993, Anthony Hopkins starred in a movie called Shadowlands, much loved, telling the love story between C.S. Lewis and Joy towards the end of his life. Just back in 2021, The Most Reluctant Convert, another Hollywood movie, told the story of C.S. Lewis becoming a Christian. And indeed, this year, just last month, there was a new movie out called Freud's Last Session, which is actually based upon a very popular theatre production that's been shown worldwide. And it tells the story of a fictional meeting between Sigmund Freud and a young C.S. Lewis, playing out a conversation between them as to whether or not there truly is a God, or as C.S. Lewis just imagined all of this because of his trauma during the war and his psychological problems. Interestingly, Anthony Hopkins stars in that movie as he did in Shadowlands, but this time he doesn't play C.S. Lewis, he plays Sigmund Freud. All to show that whatever we think about C.S. Lewis, however many of his books we have or have not read, it is indisputable that he is a giant of the modern cultural literary scene. And that is saying something. It's quite remarkable, for he was a Christian. And he was an apologist. He was bold in defending the Christian claims against the culture of his day. And given how hostile our culture is today to Christianity, surely we have to do something to try to understand what is it about C.S. Lewis that God has used him so powerfully, even in our anti-Christian culture. Well, you need to know something about his life. He was born in 1898, November the 29th, in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where I am from. The house there, which he was raised in, is 5 minutes walk from my family home that I lived in during my secondary school years. His mother died of cancer when he was just 9 years old. Something I think is significant. Our parental early upbringing and schooling is significant in terms of the kinds of people we become. He served in World War I and was horrified at the traumatizing violence and the horror of what man can do to man. In 1925, after the war, he became a fellow and tutor in English literature at Magdalen College, Oxford. 1929, he became a Christian after an intellectual journey and conversations with friends such as J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings. They would meet regularly with other authors to reflect and talk about their imaginary creations and their contributions to literature. Tolkien, of course, was a Roman Catholic. Lewis became an Anglican Christian. In 1931, he was elected to the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Magdalen in Cambridge. Arguably at that time thought to be the best read man alive. His promotion to this very senior chair suggests not only his brilliance and his indisputed recognition of achievement in the world of academia, but also, of course, he was resented by his peers in Oxford. They didn't like the way he wrote books that were so popular. They didn't like the way he was invited to speak on the BBC regularly, on the radio. 1933, published The Pilgrim's Regress. Out of the Silent Planet, 1938. During World War II, he gave his BBC radio talks explaining the Christian message. Quite remarkable that was done. They were then published as a book called Mere Christianity, which remains one of the best-selling, most widely read apologetic books in the world. Even those today who have written popular apologetic books still say there's something about Mere Christianity which has power. 1950, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia, published. It's actually the second book in the chronological story, but the first to be published. It is the wardrobe through which you enter into the world of all 7 books, Narnia. 1954, he moved to Cambridge, or became the professor of medieval Renaissance literature there. Towards the end of his life, 1956, he married Joy Davidman, an American writer, and just 4 years later, Joy died of cancer. And we'll talk more about that towards the end of our session, but I do find it very striking when you look at Lewis's biography that at the start of his life as a child, his mother died. At the end of his life, his much-loved wife died. His life is bookended by the death of the most important loved woman in his life. And in the middle of the rest of his life, those many decades, he mainly spent his life with men and his imagination. 1963, he died on November the 22nd, just 1 week shy of his 65th birthday. His life is significant and important, as evidenced by the numbers of people who wrote books about their experience of him. Many people did so. As evidenced by the way movies are made about his life. There's something about his life is moving, romantic, exciting. The Atheist Professor, who became a Christian and then wrote children's stories. There's something quite magical about it. But how did Lewis view himself? Well, he viewed himself very much as a professor of English literature, which is what he was. So some of his books are very academic books about the nature of words. He wrote the Oxford History of English Literature volume on the 16th century, that big landmark book which marks out the way academics would interpret this key area of literature. He wrote a preface to Paradise Lost. So he was very much an academic. You know, you could go to the university and you could be tutored by him in English literature. He had views about how to do that, outraged at the way students were coming along, not knowing Shakespeare, not knowing the Bible. How can you understand English literature if you don't know all of the allusions to the Bible? That was even before he became a Christian. In his academic studies of English literature, there's a sense in which Lewis had an awareness of the heart and passions and desires. So he was a man's man. He was a bachelor. He was a former soldier in the war. But through his reading of literature, as he said, you know, I know more of love and romance than the man who's married, for I see all of life through the eyes of Shakespeare and the greatest lovers who've ever lived. He was a very emotive man who through the world of literature had a sense of the passions and the desire that when he read the great myths of literature, he had a sense that they were connecting to a human desire for something, for beauty, for homecoming, for acceptance, for meaning, for truth. And so he talked about the myths being a pull in the human heart. The question, of course, was, is there a true myth, so to speak? Is there a romance story? Is there a rescue story which isn't just made up by the Greeks or the Romans or the medievals? What about our view of Lewis today as Reformed Christians? He's still talked about today, and during his lifetime, Time magazine had him on the cover. Just last month, The Spectator magazine had an article called The Greatness of C.S. Lewis. As Christmas time is coming, who better to write about in The Spectator than C.S. Lewis? So he's still talked about in the wider culture, but what about Reformed conservative Christians such as ourselves? Well, I think this is where it can get a bit difficult, because C.S. Lewis is lauded often as an evangelical Christian. And then people look at his books and begin to read them, and they find there's lots of things he wrote and said that actually we would have very serious problems with theologically. For example, you look at the way he talked about his church experience. And he wasn't really a member of a church the way we would want somebody to be. He went along to his chapel, he took his Greek New Testament and his prayer book, but he wasn't a member of a church in the way we would understand church to be. He goes in, he listens to the choir, he listens to a little few-minute sermon, and then he leaves. When you read his book on the Psalms, he talks about the imprecatory Psalms, the Psalms which call out for God's wrath to be poured out on his enemies. And he writes virulently about how horrified he would be to think that this is actually God's word. He calls into question the doctrine of Scripture at this point. When you look at the story of Narnia and you see Aslan representing Jesus, and you see him going to die to end the winter of sin that means Narnia is always winter but never Christmas, when you see the nature of the atonement described there, you find that the idea is that Aslan will die as a ransom, that he will in some way pay off the debt that the wicked witch has. Well, that of course is not our understanding of how the cross works. Jesus didn't go to the cross to pay a ransom to the devil. He redeems us from our sin, but the atonement is a redemption which God, in a sense, pays to himself, to his own righteousness. So his theology of the cross is not what we would say would be an accurate Reformed evangelical theology. When you look at his theology of suffering, he talks in his book on suffering about the importance of maintaining a high view of the freedom of the human will, that in a very real sense, some suffering that comes to us in life is inevitable because God will not transgress the human will's freedom. Well, that is a far cry from Reformed biblical Christian understanding of the human will, isn't it? When you look at his teaching about hell, he clearly believed there was such a place as hell, but his theology on free will feeds through to it in such a way that he emphasizes the idea that people choose to go to hell if they're in hell. They're not in hell because of God's sovereign choice. Again, that is a far cry from the full-orbed Reformed theology of God's glorification of himself in the punishment of sinners. Finally, you see doctrinally that there are implicit comments made in his books which suggest the idea that it's possible for somebody to go to heaven though they have not knowingly put their faith in Jesus Christ. So Tash, in the last battle, the 7th book of Narnia, Tash is the anti-Aslan, the false god. And Aslan tells one of the soldiers in the book, quote, "All the service thou hast done to Tash, I accept as service done to me." And the implication is that somebody who has been a willing, knowing servant of the false idol, because they were sincere, will be accepted into heaven. Now, if you look at that list that I've just given very briefly, and more could be said, when you start talking about the nature of church, Scripture, the atonement, the human will, and who goes to heaven, if you're wrong on those areas, you're a long way from where somebody would say there's an evangelical Christian. And yet C.S. Lewis is lauded as a great evangelical. And this, I think, causes us great difficulty. Great difficulty. Because as people try and claim that somebody like C.S. Lewis was an evangelical Christian, and then people find he said things that don't fit with that, it makes it very hard for us to be willing to learn from him. We focus on where he erred. We focus on the problems and the disagreements. And I think it's far more fruitful for us just to accept that somebody like C.S. Lewis was not actually an evangelical Christian. And I don't think there's any shame in saying that. I can assure you from my wide reading of C.S. Lewis that were we to call him an evangelical Christian in his presence, he would be outraged and irritated. He wouldn't want to be identified as such. He viewed himself as something different. And I think that there's something within us, isn't there, in our Christian culture, that we love to label somebody and say, he's one of us. And if he's one of us, then we can claim him. And the success and the influence that he had, well, we can sort of benefit from that. Wouldn't it be far more healthy just to accept he was a very unusual man? He was a unique man, uniquely gifted and with unique weaknesses. And God used him in an amazing way. And we can just give thanks for that. And we can accept that there's areas where he erred, things he didn't understand or get right. And then we're just free to learn from him. We can say, what does he do or say that is really helpful, that we can benefit from in our apologetics? Let's not try and claim him and label him as one of us, or just reject him because people do that and we can see it doesn't make sense. Let's be willing to learn from people who are different to us and just give thanks to God for what is good in them. 6 ways, then, in which we can learn from C.S. Lewis's apologetics. First of all, speak of your conversion. One of the books that C.S. Lewis published was called Surprised by Joy, The Shape of My Early Life. It is autobiographical, but he reveals very little of his life. It's actually a book which is designed to lead you up to the 2 pages where he describes his becoming a Christian. And all he really tells you is what you need to know to feel the emotional power and the weight of his conversion. It is very significant from a literary point of view because I speak as somebody who enjoys English literature myself. It is very unusual, very, very difficult to describe true Christian conversion in literature. Almost nobody has done it well. And so this autobiographical page from Surprised by Joy actually stands as a very significant piece of writing to give somebody else a sense of what it means to become a Christian in a unique way. It's different for everybody, but there's a supernatural experience which is common. Lewis achieves it. Here he is, one of the most famous conversion stories ever committed to paper. Quote, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen College night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I did not then see what is now a most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet, but who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking and struggling, resentful and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape? The words compelle entrare, compel them to come in, have been so abused by wicked men that we shudder at them, but properly understood, they plumb the depth of divine mercy. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation." As J.I. Packer observed, when on our knees, all men are Calvinists. And again, C.S. Lewis would reject the label, but as he described his conversion, he accepts and praises God. You compelled me to come. And I just think it's a great lesson for us that one of the great apologetic tools we have is we can speak of our conversion. To tell somebody how you became a Christian, to say, can I tell you what God has done in my life? Can I tell you how I used to feel like this and I used to think like you did? And here's what God did for me. You have a story and a tool that is unique to you, given to you by God. And to be able to share it, to seek and to pray for an opportunity to speak of it is very, very powerful. It may well be the apologetic strategy that God uses to draw somebody into relationship with Jesus. Speak of your conversion, 1. Secondly, focus on what matters. Focus on what matters. Mere Christianity is Lewis's central apologetic work. He did, by the way, describe himself as an apologist in some of his writings. He understood that's what he was doing. Mere Christianity, by which Lewis meant the mere essentials, the things that are most important to believe in order to be a Christian. Not the denominational distinctives, the way you govern your church, the way you organize the Lord's Supper, what you sing in a church service. Lewis knew that to be an apologist, you had to focus on that which really matters. Not that the other things don't matter. He actually does say in the book, I do want you to find the church that's right for you and settle in the way that really suits you and the way God's designed you, but I am writing about the important central things that all Christians hold in common. It is a classical piece of apologetics in the sense that he begins with arguments for God existing and then moves on to show that Jesus is that God, that two-step argument that marks out the classical apologist. In his book, he uses positive and negative approaches to talk about God's existence. Positively, he makes much of ethics. He lived in an England where there was a widespread acceptance that there is such a thing as right and wrong. And people had a fairly shared view as to what was right and wrong in terms of how we treat people. And so he pled to that and he built on that and he explored how that requires there to be a God. It makes no sense if God is not there. It's an evidence. Our sense of right and wrong is an evidence that there is a God. He also used negative arguments. So he argued against the reasonableness of believing that this is a non-supernatural universe. Argued against the evolutionary worldview which was beginning to become so popular and fashionable in the academic world of his day. And as he presented this argument in this book, which originally, remember, was a set of broadcasts on BBC Radio, he used one of his most famous arguments, known as the Jesus trilemma apologetic. He lays out three options as to what you may reasonably make of Jesus if you read his words and teachings in the New Testament. And he says this, quote, "A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell." You read what Jesus said. He claimed to be God. He claimed to forgive sins. Don't patronize me by saying, oh, Jesus was a great teacher, because that's what people like to say at the time. Don't want to dismiss him totally. Church is a good thing to have in society, people thought in his day. Jesus is a great moral teacher. But Lewis says, read him yourself. The things he said are not the kinds of things a good moral teacher said. He was either totally insane or a deceptive devil. It's a very powerful argument that still has weight today, and it invites people to read the New Testament for themselves. Focus on what matters in your conversation. Don't get drawn into your particular view about the way to govern your church with the non-Christian. Don't get drawn into the big debate about the exact way to engage with some cultural moment that you're talking with your Christian friends about. Focus on what matters, mere Christianity. Thirdly, explore the subtleties of sin. I think this is one of the things that Lewis did so wonderfully and doesn't come to our mind naturally. Lewis wrote the book, The Screwtape Letters, in which he, with great humor and wit, portrays letters from a senior devil to a junior devil on how to manipulate and cajole a person into not trusting in Jesus Christ. And it's very witty and funny, but also he picks up on all the little foibles of sin. You know, that sin in the heart is not just the big things like fighting against people and killing them and stealing. It's the little grumpiness, the little aspects of negativity and cruelty that bubble up in our speech. And by laying out the subtleties of this, and people read it and they laugh, and they think, oh yeah, that's me. He creates space for the sense of, I actually need forgiveness. So the senior devil writes to the junior devil at one point, "At home, hatred usually expresses itself by saying things that seem harmless on paper, the words aren't offensive, but in such a voice or at such a moment that they're not far short of a blow in the face. To keep this game up, see to it that these two in the family, these two fools, have a sort of double standard. Your patient must demand that all his own utterances are to be taken at their face value and judged just on the words, while at the same time he must judge all of his mother's speech with the fullest and most hypersensitive interpretations of tone and context that are possible. She must be encouraged to do the same thing to him. And hence, from every quarrel, they can both go away convinced, or very nearly convinced, that they are quite innocent, but full of rage at the other." And Lewis is just describing the way many people live and act. The Bible gives us insight to sin that the world doesn't get. And by sharing some of that insight, and maybe just being humble and sharing the way I've mistreated somebody, the way I've been cruel to somebody. I remember a friend saying to me that it really took somebody aback when they said sorry to their friend for the way they'd spoken to them. But they, instead of doing what people normally do and giving the pretend apology, which isn't an apology, I'm so sorry you felt offended. Yeah. I'm so sorry you misunderstood me. You see? My friend gave a proper apology, and he was honest. So I'm so sorry I said that to you. I just did it because I thought it would make me feel good. I'm sorry. That was honesty. And in that moment of honesty, he exposes the nature of sin and creates the shared sense of we all need forgiveness. Lewis was brilliant at exploring the nature of sin. In one of his speeches called The Inner Ring, he explored another aspect of sin. He opened this speech by quoting from War and Peace. It's a scene where a soldier walks into a dinner party, and he knows that in the room there are people who have official rankings in the army as to who should speak first, who's in charge, but he also knew there was an unofficial, unspoken rule about who was really important, the special people, the people in the inner ring. And he knew that they were the ones who had to show respect to. You wanted to be in with them, and they weren't necessarily the person who was the most senior army officer in the room. And so Lewis argues in The Inner Ring that these inner rings are everywhere. They shape all of society, at school, at work, in church. There's a sense that there's an inner group of special people, and you want to be in with that group. And he says it's like an onion. You peel away a layer of the onion, and there's another layer underneath, and then another. You never get to the end. And if you do, you find it's all gone. There's nothing left of the onion. And he says, of all the things in this world that are used most often to make good men do wicked things, it's a desire to be in the inner ring. He says this, as long as you're governed by the desire to be in an inner ring, you will never get what you want. You're trying to peel an onion, and if you ever succeed, you'll find there's nothing left in your hand. Until you conquer the fear of being an outsider, you will remain an outsider. It's clear if you think about it. If you want to be made free of a certain circle, if you want to become part of a musical society because you really like music, then you can be satisfied and enjoy being in the orchestra. But if you want to be in the orchestra because you want to be in the inner ring of the people in that orchestra, you'll join it. And then you'll find there's another little quartet in the orchestra which are even more in the inner ring. There's another inner ring, and you want to be in that one. And you will find you can have no pleasure in the music. For the circle cannot come from within the charm it had from the outside. By the very act of entering the inner ring, it loses its magic. Isn't it true everybody wants to be in an inner ring? I've shared that article to people, and they've read it, and they've just said, it's changed my life. I see the way the world works now. It's a sinful world. I don't want to be in the inner ring. I just want to be accepted by Jesus. And he does welcome you in. And he does satisfy. Another way Lewis explored the subtleties of sin was using his children's storybooks. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace is the selfish, deceptive, proud little boy. And what happens to him? He's turned into a dragon. It's a great story. He's turned into a dragon. Here's Lewis describing what it's like to be so corrupted by sin that you become a dragon. In spite of the pain, Eustace's first feeling was one of relief. There was nothing to be afraid of anymore. He was a terror himself, and nothing in the world but a knight, and not even all of those, would dare attack him. He would get even with Caspian and Edmund now. But the moment he thought this, he realized he didn't want to any longer. He wanted to be friends. He wanted to get back among humans and talk and laugh and share things. He realized that he was a monster cut off from the whole human race. An appalling loneliness came over him. He began to see that the others had not really been fiends at all. He began to wonder if he himself had been such a nice person as he always supposed. He longed for their voices. He would have been grateful for a kind word, even from Reepicheep. When he thought of this, the poor dragon that had been Eustace lifted up his voice and wept. A powerful dragon crying its eyes out under the moon in a deserted valley is a sight and a sound hardly to be imagined. Our world is full of people who are dragons. They thought they would enjoy having power over others and asserting their will, but actually they're just crying out for a friend. That's the nature of sin in the fallen world. Is it not the case that Lewis's children's story captures something of the need of a Savior that is valuable and insightful? Do talk with people about the nature of sin. Fourthly, defend the supernatural. Lewis wrote a book called Miracles, And he argued in this book a very powerful apologetic argument. He said, look, people decide from the start whether or not they're going to believe in a supernatural world. It's a philosophical decision. They may pretend to themselves and you that they've been convinced by the evidence that nothing supernatural can happen. A man can't rise from the dead. A man can't walk on water. But actually, no amount of evidence can sway them either which way. They decide from the start whether or not to believe in the possibility of a God who does miracles. And so he says in that book, Christianity is the story of a great miracle. A naturalistic Christianity leaves out all that is specifically Christian. So if you're trying to defend the Christian faith to people, then don't think that because you're being reasonable in it and you're trying to lay it out in a way that makes sense, you have to hide the fact that it's a supernatural religion. Be honest about that. If you're defending a religion which is not supernatural, it's not Christianity you're presenting. Lewis, this great apologist, was very open. The supernatural is real. That's the Christian faith I'm defending. So do talk about that and defend it. Just two more. We mentioned this when we talked about his literary background. Connect with deep longings. The Chronicles of Narnia. Why are they so powerful still today? These children's books, these imaginary stories of talking animals and wizards and Narnia. What is it about them? Well, on one level, the story is funny, moving, insightful. It gives people the furniture with which to understand the Christian message. Think of the children in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe hearing for the first time about Aslan the lion, who clearly represents Jesus. Is he a man? Asked Lucy. Aslan a man? Said Mr. Beaver sternly. Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I'd thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Oh, that you will, dearie, and no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly. Then he isn't safe? Asked Lucy. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Oh, I'm longing to see him, said Peter, even if I do feel frightened when it comes to the point. Well, look, C.S. Lewis may not have been a Westminster Confession man, but does he not there write and picture for us better than most Presbyterians the true nature of what it means to fear a God who is determined to glorify himself? Is this not a vivid portrayal of the reality of coming before a God that we must fear and glorify? A God who is good, but all glorious? Now there's something about the story and the portrayal of the beauty of God in this children's narrative that it is compelling, but why does it connect so deeply with people? Well, just in recent years, somebody wrote a book which perhaps adds to our understanding of why this is so. For he shows, in this book, Planet Narnia by Michael Ward, he shows how Lewis very carefully constructed the themes and the feel and the background imagery of each one of the 7 books in the Chronicles of Narnia. And each one of the 7 books has a theme or a feel which links to one of the planetary gods that the medieval world thought governed and shaped the world. So, for example, Jupiter was the god of Jove, of joviality and generosity. And that's the one that links with the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so there's lots of things in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe which create that sense of, God is going to bring a sense of joy and happiness back into the world. Now, how does this work? Well, the point is that Michael Ward is suggesting that the Chronicles of Narnia, each book plugs into deep human longings and desires, which have actually been reflected back in the medieval world's literature and their outlook to the world, which of course isn't true. The world is not designed in such a way that it's shaped by the planets. They are not gods. But through all of literature, art, and music, the desires and the passions and the longings which were represented in those medieval planetary views of the world, they are the desires and the passions which flow through all of art, literature, and music. People today still do want to be happy. They still do have a sense that they want that acceptance and that love, that familial joining together. Well, Lewis didn't just give an intellectual argument for it in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He just suffused the whole book with imagery and words and conversations which evoke that sense. And similarly with other things in the other books, things like envy and sin and death. They're all there, but in a way that's beneath the surface. Indeed, there's places in the books where perhaps the language might have revealed too obviously what he was doing. And you can see through the revisions of the manuscripts, he crossed out the words which might have given the game away. He wanted it to be a secret. He wanted it to have an effect on you without you knowing, without you sort of articulating it to yourself, because he knew that the magic, the beauty, the power would be all the more real to people if they didn't even notice it happening. The lesson for us, I think, is when we're talking to people about Jesus Christ, when we're answering their objections, do connect with the deep longings. Recognize that people have things they really, really want. They desire to be accepted. They want to be happy. They want to see the grief and bereavement and the problem of sin and broken relationships fixed. And we know that in Jesus Christ that can all be done. So don't just sort of push aside what people want and then just try and slam on top of them the intellectual evidence for Christianity. Listen to what it is they want. Ask them how they're doing in life. And see how Jesus Christ connects with their deepest longings. The Chronicles of Narnia, I think, models that in a very unusual way. Sixthly and finally, something that C.S. Lewis can do for us, he can help us weep with those who weep. He recognized that people go through life and have great sufferings and trials and burdens. Back in 1940, he wrote a book called The Problem of Pain, in which he tried to enter into the problems and arguments about suffering and grief and loss in this life. It was criticized as being overly cerebral, overly intellectual, and I think that's a fair criticism, actually. He has lots of speculative arguments in it as he thinks about whether or not animals will go to heaven and the significance of animal suffering. It does have the feel a little bit of an Oxford professor sort of just playing a game, thinking about a big intellectual problem of suffering. But then, at the end of his life, just a few years before his death, he married Joy. And they had a very happy, fulfilled marriage of love and mutual concern. Although it was a short marriage, for she died of cancer. And so in 1961, under a pseudonym, the great Oxford-Cambridge professor of English literature published a little book, only about 50 pages long, called A Grief Observed. The first edition was supposedly written by somebody called N.W. Clerk, and somehow was reviewed in the Times and the newspapers as being by this unknown man who's just popped out of nowhere and written this incredible book, N.W. Clerk. Only after his death was it republished under his real name, A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. It is an agonizing, traumatizing book to read, for he pours out in his reflections the horror, the shame, the anger, the grief of losing his wife. He talks about how grief feels like fear, drowning in it. It is Job-like. It is harrowing to read. And yet in my ministry over the last 12 or so years, I've seen no book more used in people's lives after a bereavement to hold them in church. For he gives you the words. This is the great literary scholar of his day, using his gifts of words and language and romance literature to express that most common experience, a husband or a wife bereaved and bereft at a loss in this world without the one they love. And as you read through it, you find although he focuses on the pain and the grief and the agony, he does mention and he does help you see that the expression of this can be an expression done honestly before God. The sharing of the grief and the horror and the fear can open the door again in time to a more peaceful, joy-filled prayer towards God. And so in our apologetics, we must weep with those who weep. Realize that, as Lewis said in his earlier book, suffering can often be God's megaphone to wake us up to him. And when we come across people who are suffering, we can empathize, we can weep with them, as Romans says. And it is an opportunity not to be cruel or crass or simplistic, But in that moment, they may be more open to finding out there is a God who loves them than they've ever been. Weep with those who weep. Those are 6 lessons that I think we can take from C.S. Lewis's Apologetics. There are many more, but I'm happy to take questions and chat with you for a few moments now.
Peter, thank you indeed. I think we're going to need some time to digest that. There was a huge amount in a short period, and we'll express our gratitude properly in a moment. But let me give you a question which goes back to the first session, and it comes from Andrew, who's online. Jesus used questions. Please, would you give us some of the questions that you found helpful to ask in apologetic conversations?
Yeah, very, very good point. Yeah, Jesus asked many questions, and questions were used to great effect actually by Cornelius Van Til. So he would often want to ask people questions that don't try to prove to them that there is a God, because that would be to fall into the approach that he didn't agree with. But Cornelius Van Til would ask questions that try to sort of destabilize the security of the assumptions of the person they're talking to. So he would ask questions like, why have you come to hold that belief? Why do you feel so strongly about that? Have you come to that belief on the basis of evidence, or just because you were raised to believe it to be true? Personally, I found the sorts of questions to be useful in my own ministry that invite a person to be more personal and more vulnerable and more open about where they're coming from. So I certainly agree with Van Til that asking the question, why do you believe that, or why do you care about that, is a really powerful question. Asking a person questions that lead them to reveal how much knowledge and experience they have of Jesus in the Bible is very helpful. Because quite often people can have very strong feelings about God, very committed to the idea that God is not there, but they've not actually read the Bible for themselves. So a very useful apologetic question to ask somebody is, have you ever read right through one of the books of the Bible for yourself? And almost always the answer will be no, almost always. And then the question becomes, well, would you like to? Would you like to come along to church with me and hear a little bit of the Bible read in church and hear it preached? Or would you like to read a little bit of the Bible with me over coffee as we chat about it? And then you've taken the exchange away from a kind of a me and you in a debate. You've taken it away to me and you together looking at God's Word and learning together. So I find that to be a very fruitful question to ask. Or one final question that is a good apologetics question. If you want to open up some of the classical evidential apologetics for the resurrection of Jesus, that's a really good question to ask about. Say to the person, have you ever considered for yourself the evidence for Jesus rising from the dead? It can be combined with, my personal testimony. Have you ever considered the evidence for Jesus rising from the dead? I used to think it was absolutely ridiculous. I was absolutely flabbergasted when I began to realize and read the Bible for myself and realized that there's just overwhelming evidence. Can you believe it? And it becomes an adventure of exploring together. So there's a couple of ideas, but there are many other things you could ask, many other.
That was a very fruitful question. Thank you, Andrew. It occurs to me that Philip, when he's dialoguing with Nathanael at the beginning of John's Gospel, and Nathanael says to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? He simply says, come and see. A little bit like, why not read and meet this person, Jesus Christ? Thank you, Peter. Chris, I'll give you the mic.
Peter, I'm thinking about the first talk and the issue of to what extent it's right to give children, encourage them to sit over and above the truths that we hold as parents or as Christians. I'm thinking of the RE teacher who has to teach multi-religions and sets before them a kind of pick and mix attitude towards religion. I'm thinking of the covenant parent who has their children before them and says, do you find this credible? Does this seem reasonable to you? In your judgment, what do you think? And I want to ask you a difficult question, which is, do you think that is wrong and dishonors God, or do you think there's a role for it?
So this idea of when I'm teaching children, am I sitting above the claims of the Bible and sort of teaching them and encouraging them to understand them in a way that people like Cornelius Van Til would say is very unhealthy, because it's making them feel like they're in charge of the Bible, they're in charge of God, they're weighing it up and comparing it. I think that, particularly with teaching children, there's a sense in which it is necessary up to a point, that part of drawing together the information and the data of the Christian faith, they do need to have stuff laid out for them. So the key thing is not that we never do that and never permit it. The key thing is that those of us who are born-again Christians and covenant parents, we genuinely make a real effort to show our children at various times that we are not sitting in judgment over the Bible and God, that actually the knowledge we have of God from the Bible moves us to worship him and be excited about him, so that I am actually amazed at who God is and moved by his grace towards me. And I let my children see that in terms of how I pray at family prayers, in terms of how we talk about church. When I leave church with my children at the end of the day, is lunchtime a time for me to sort of critique the preacher and argue about all the little things I thought weren't quite right? Or do I express to my children in front of them how humbled I was to hear God speak to me? So I think that only the Christian can do that, but I think if we only did that and didn't lay out some of the data of the Christian religion, we probably wouldn't be teaching them and training them. So it's both. And be aware that the education that non-Christians give people about religion in school and so forth cannot do the one thing that matters most. They cannot show the posture of humility before the Lord. Do you want to come back to me on that, Chris? Do you think that's fair?
No, thank you. Just to say, I think that's quite a hard thing to do. You're both laying things before them and telling them what is good and right and honours God. And I think it has to be done with great discretion, and it's a challenge, isn't it? So thank you very much. I have a question for the second part, but would you like me to wait?
We'll pass over to Nikos and come back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Peter. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. My words won't convert anybody. I can't convert anybody. Neither can you. Neither can C.S. Lewis. It's only God through the Holy Spirit. So my question is, to what degree, if any, do we use the scriptures as part of our apologetic?
So to what degree do we use scripture as part of our apologetic? So two parts to my answer to that. Firstly, remember from the very start of the first session, apologetics is not evangelism. Apologetics is something the Bible encourages us to do and something we're encouraged to prepare for and reflect on. But it's not the full story. It's not evangelism, it's not mission. It is more of a preparatory defensive work. So we don't need to worry about the fact that apologetics doesn't do everything. But secondly, I think that there can be places and ways in which we draw in verses or texts from the Bible and use them in our apologetics. We can also be sharing with other people things we've learned from the Bible or that are revealed only in the Bible. So, for example, think about Paul giving his apologia before the court in Acts. And we read that before Festus, Paul discoursed on the judgment to come. Now, it's quite a radical thing that his defense was not just to say, well, actually, I've not done anything wrong here. His defense was to talk about the judgment to come. But God uses that. So the apology there is actually talking about something revealed in Scripture, the judgment to come, but I take it is the way that Paul did it, that he did it with gentleness and respect, that he had a lack of concern for his own well-being as he stood in the court, and that was actually the power that came upon those who listened to him. So I think we do talk about the things in the Bible, and as I said before, it's a very good idea to use questions that invite people to look at the Bible for themselves, because apologetics is trying to clear the space, ultimately to let them read the Bible, hear what it says, and believe and be saved. But you're quite right, apologetics does not save people in and of itself. It is a preparatory defensive work. Thank you, Nikos.
What do you think the reason is that there is so little Reformed or even just evangelical representation among the giants of literature?
Why is there so little Reformed representation amongst the giants of literature? Well, I suppose all parts of the Christian church have different strengths and weaknesses, and there will be a more diverse bunch of people in heaven than I choose to affiliate with denominationally on earth, and that's part of God, the glory and the beauty of God's kingdom. I do think that we can be too hard on ourselves. I think in our course on apologetics, we had a session looking at the apologetic ministry of Francis Schaeffer, one of my favorite apologists, and he was a Presbyterian who engaged in all of the things Presbyterians are so known for: ecclesiastical debate, all kinds of doctrinal matters were written about by him, but then he engaged in a broad, very warm-hearted, enlivening apologetics ministry. So we can be too hard on ourselves, but if there are distinctive strengths and weaknesses from different traditions in the Christian faith, we can rejoice about the fact that it will all be resolved in heaven and we will all be together. Yeah.
I'm going back to Chris.
Thank you very much. Your talk on C.S. Lewis. I think one of the comments I've heard is that, that C.S. Lewis himself acknowledged that he was not a theologian.
Yes.
And I wondered whether you have advice, in a sense, for budding writers about whether they should train in theology and literature at the same time. And how do they guard against a sort of paralyzed pen where they think they have to get everything theologically correct before they can bless people with their writings?
Yes.
Because I think if I had the theology of C.S. Lewis, I would never have got, and knew what I knew, I'd never have put a pen to paper.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, Lewis did live in a different world. One of the problems about getting good writing today in the Christian church is the academic publishing industry world. It is a business, sort of an industry almost, and there's a pressure upon people to pump out books at a volume, and most Christian books that are written today are copy and paste jobs, repeating things that are said by somebody else. Lewis was sort of doing it as a real art form, in his own idiosyncratic way, and it is hard to replicate that approach to life without a deep, passionate love for reading widely yourself. So I think to just enjoy reading is a triumph today. The screens and the pressure on time management and stuff make it hard for most people. Lewis did write about how to write. He'd several articles about it where he talked about how to write children's stories, how to approach them, how to read. And they're well worth looking at, to be honest. He talked in one of them about the need to write about something that you're really interested in and enjoy and care about. So becoming a good writer about Christian theology would surely mean you're passionate about God and Christianity. And I think the issue about knowing your theological position and stuff, again, things have changed a bit in the world that, remember, just after World War II in England, there were not a great number of really good Christian books around. Liberalism dominated the academic theological world, and this is one of the reasons why Banner of Truth became so significant and important. Republishing and rediscovering Puritan books was a significant ministry, which today we may think, well, of course, it's easy to get them. But Lewis was writing at a different moment in time. So today, I think there's less excuse for being a theological writer and really not understanding some stuff. One final comment about Lewis and his errors or weaknesses in writing and theology. It's easy to forget that nobody ever taught C.S. Lewis theology. When he says he wasn't a theologian, not only was he not a theologian, he wasn't a theological student. There was nobody to teach him. There was no classes to go to. There was no other good Christian books to read, in a sense, easily accessible. So what I find astonishing about C.S. Lewis is not that he made some mistakes, but given the fact that nobody ever taught him, and all he had was his Greek New Testament, and probably fairly shallow, woolly thoughts for the day by an Anglican chapel clergyman, given that's all he had, isn't it remarkable how much he got right? It actually reassures me that God actually really can use the New Testament to guide people into heaven.
Well, thank you. I know we could keep going with the questions, but I think probably we need to draw it to an end. You would want me to express our appreciation to Dr. Sandlin for teaching us this morning. You've given us an enormous amount of things to think about. We sometimes talk in the seminary about head to heart to hands. And that's the challenge as we finish this morning. Those truths that we've experienced, especially from the scriptures, should warm our hearts, that we should love this majestic God who has glorified himself through the salvation of lost sinners. And that we should then let that impel us in our witness.